Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Configure Stage UX Showcase. I am Maria Rachni. I am the Senior Product Designer for the Configure Stage, and today I'm going to be talking about designing the GitLab Kubernetes agent. First, a bit of context. In my last UX Showcase, I spoke about the design sprint we run for our Kubernetes management direction. So, we run the design sprint to figure out a new direction for Kubernetes management because our Kubernetes integration has a relatively low usage. And also there are some security concerns because in order to manage their clusters from GitLab, the users had to open their clusters to GitLab, so give permissions to GitLab to get information from the clusters. So why are we implementing a new way of managing the Kubernetes clusters through the agent? This is going to provide a more secure way to connect a cluster to GitLab, and also it's going to have more benefits, which I'm talking about in the next screen. Here is the epic in case you want to check out all the work that's being done and that has been done already around the agent. So as a business outcome, we're hoping we're going to increase the adoption of Kubernetes, of the configure state features around Kubernetes. And I think which is closely linked to the monitor stage as well, so since clusters are being monitored around the monitoring features. Also, it will allow us to introduce more features around the clusters as we will have better access to the cluster. So for a bit of maybe more context, here is a basic diagram to the architecture. The Kubernetes cluster will have an agent installed in it. And then the GitLab is going to have another agent, which currently is called CAS, and then it's going to be bi-directional communication. I guess the arrow is pointing out that the cluster agent is going to send us information. So this is the way that at least the architecture has been designed. So why is this important for the customers? The customers are now going to have the security concerns that they currently have with our implementations, and hopefully they will be able to import their cloud infrastructure, their cloud Kubernetes infrastructure in GitLab in order to use GitLab as a single DevOps application and not jump around GitLab and other ways to manage their clusters. And also we will enable our users to follow GitOps workflows. I have linked an issue here if you want to find out more about GitOps workflows. So user research. What user research have we done for this to validate our solution? So as it was the outcome of the design sprint, the final stage of a design sprint naturally is to test an interactive prototype, or in our case, a storyboard that explains the concept and the basic flow for implementing the concept. So we ran 5 sessions, 5 one-hour sessions with 5 participants that were matching the persona DevOps engineer. 3 of the participants were GitLab users, 2 were not, and none of the users unfortunately used the configure stage features, which meant that some of their attention was distracted by seeing for the first time functionality they had not seen before. And for the 2 users that were not GitLab users, they were distracted by concepts like event project or the GitLab concepts they were not aware of. So we would need, in my opinion, further user research with more expert GitLab users. However, we did have some learnings from the research we did. And one of the main ones were that the agents were familiar with the agent concept. It's quite a common and widespread solution to install an agent on a cluster and to be able to produce functionality or connections. I'm not 100% familiar with all the features. However, there were some concepts that were unclear to the users. So the connection between clusters, agent, and what we call manifest projects, and the application projects that are deployed on the cluster were not clear. Maybe it was a storyboard, maybe it was a lack of GitLab knowledge for some of them. However, there was a confusion that needed to be taken into account for the design. And finally, the flow, the initial flow that we showed them in the storyboard of installing, importing the cluster or connecting the cluster as we call it these days, and installing the agent seemed to be very confusing. So these were good findings and a good starting point for the design stage. In terms of constraints, I personally felt I was restrained by the implementation details as it was decided by the development team. So the concept was that we have the flow of importing a cluster to GitLab, and then the installing the agent, but the configuration of the agent lives in another project that needs to be connected to the cluster project. And then there is another project called the manifest project, which also needs to be connected to the cluster project. So all these connections rang the bell of a confusing user experience, but I felt I was restrained by the implementation. And I'm still trying to figure out how to make it a more intuitive experience, or whether the persona system administrator, platform engineer, and DevOps engineer are familiar with these flows and it wouldn't be confusing to them. The goals of implementing the agent, starting with a job to be done. When I am responsible for my organization's cloud infrastructure, I want to have a secure way to manage my clusters so that I can handle my deployment, my development team's deployments. That was roughly the job I could come up with. Might be very specific, but the gist is that as a platform engineer, I want to manage my infrastructure and deploy my development, my team's applications on this infrastructure. Iterating towards the MVC. So the first step was to start discussing the requirements for the MVC in an issue that I have linked here. During this discussion, I discovered that many of the implementation decisions and details were still under discussion between the PM and the engineering team. So I felt I needed to get more clarity on those before I started designing. And in addition to that, the MVC functionality had not been entirely decided yet or fleshed out yet. So I started a conversation in this issue. And then I started designing based on the installation instructions that the PM created for the documentation. So in order to give an idea, this is the initial issue that we're discussing a lot of the implementation details. And following, this is the documentation that the PM created for the installation. So it's a UI-like the documentation that was intended to help me design the feature. So, and following the design iteration 1, followed the design iteration 2, which I'm gonna talk about later. So I started by designing based on the documentation, and maybe it would be more useful to see the screens from directly from the issue. So we have an empty state for the Kubernetes clusters. If we don't have an empty state, here we have a listing. And following this, we introduce the selection of whether you want to import your cluster with the agent, or you want to import your cluster with the current way, which is the certificate. And I received feedback here that why would we add the information about the two ways of importing the cluster in a tooltip and not include them here, which is valid and I agree with. Following that, I introduced sections for the agent configuration, starting with the agent name. The idea was that the user would add the agent name first and then commit the name, so that in the next step, when they select a project where they will include the agent configuration in, a directory with the agent name will be automatically created. There are two ways to to save the agent configuration. One would be to create a new configuration project, and the other one would be to use an existing project. The language was still confusing in iteration 1. So now we're viewing the flow of use an existing project. There's a dropdown, excuse me, to select the project. Apologies, the screens are a bit mixed. And this is the flow for create a new project, where I embedded the entire create project screen and functionality, so that the user wouldn't have to jump out of this flow, go to the create new project flow and come back, which was my main finding during the storyboard testing. So the feedback here from the team was whether this is absolutely necessary for the MVC. My thinking was that I want to flesh out the experience, the overall experience, and then we can decide what the MVC would be, even though I did name it MVC design, but it's good to start with a big picture and go back to the what we can do for what's the minimum we can do for the first iteration. So following that, this is the select existing project. So after you select the project from the dropdown, you go to the next step. Apologies for a bit of a mixed. So we're in the create new project. We add the project name, and then we are creating the configuration project. So the project with the name we provided was successfully created, and we provide the feedback here and a way to open. And then we automatically go to step 3, which is to provide 2 ways to set up the authentication of the agent with GitLab. I'm not going to go into details, it's quite technical. So finally, these are the 2 ways. We have a segmented button, and the final step is to provide the agent installation. And we provide 4 ways to install the agent. So this was iteration 1. I got a lot of feedback, and also the team had a review of the designs in a sync meeting. So in iteration number 2, which is this one, the starting point is the same. We add the information about the 2 ways to connect a cluster. We changed the name from import to connect because it was clearer. And so then we decided that for MVC, we're not going to create a new project. If the user wants to create a new project, they can do it outside of this flow and then link to this project. Then the step 1, the agent name, and step 2 would be merged into one step. Here I'm asking some questions regarding the agent name. There is a maximum character restriction for 63 characters instead of the 250 that is standard. And I'm asking whether we can pre-populate the name based on the project that the user is currently in. Then for the selection of the project, I was hoping we can select some projects that can be used for the agent configuration, but any project can be used to store and create the agent configuration in. So here I'm wondering whether there is some sort of prioritization we can use. And I've had the discussion in the UX channel as well, whether we can introduce an open button to preview, to be able to open a project in a new tab and preview the contents. So here the project is selected, the agent name has been filled in, so the user can go to the next step. The feedback and the final decision for this step is that we're gonna use the current project. So we're gonna remove the select project entirely, and we're gonna create a directory in the current project for the agent configuration to be stored. That will be the MVC. So following that, we have the summary of the agent configuration, which will be the current project. And we might not even need this. It would be good probably to, I haven't designed this yet, but it will be good to provide feedback to the users that the directory was created and give them the option to open the directory. And the next step will be the agent authentication with a token and the agent installation that we have fleshed out a bit more, the copy here. You can find these designs in the issue, and I've also included them in the presentation. So I'm gonna skip these screens. So as for next steps, I'm gonna finalize the designs based on the latest feedback and decisions and sign them off. And I have follow-up issues to introduce the clusters that have been connected to GitLab with the agent in the cluster listing, and to work on the cluster details page for the clusters that have been connected to GitLab with the agent. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any feedback or questions, Slack me or comment directly on the issue.